Welcome once again, my fellow manipulators of Digital Fate. I'm Richie, this is Capricorn, and today we're back at it with another spoiler video for Magic the Gathering's Final Fantasy expansion. This is actually day 9 and 10, everything that was spoiled on Monday and Tuesday. And this spoiler season is lasting particularly long. I think they're doing 2.5 weeks instead of 1.5 weeks like they normally do, which is just kind of crazy. So these cards are just gonna keep coming, and we do have a bunch of notable cards to get to today, some pretty crazy rares that dropped, and I'm really excited about how this set is turning out, so we're gonna dive right in. Before we do, please like the video. It helps me get this video out to so many more people. It helps the channel grow. I appreciate that so much more than I could put into words, more than you could possibly ever imagine, so please just hit that like button. It's so easy and it means so much. And subscribe if you're new, because I have a ton of crazy content on the way. And as soon as this set is released to early access, I will be in the early access event, and I'm going to be streaming for 24 hours. Playing all sorts of ridiculous, crazy brews that we come up with, and that one's going to be pretty nuts, and those decks will start to go live on the channel starting that same day. So there's a lot of craziness coming, and I'll have more information for you guys for early access and when that's happening and all of that pretty soon. So subscribe, hit the like button, let's do the thing, and let's jump into these. First off, we've got Balam TRexor, a 6/6 dinosaur with trample for 2 green and 4, and when it enters you gain 3 life, but it also has forest cycling for 2. It's pretty awesome that we get a version of this sort of card, like a craw worm style card, that forest cycles. So this is like the green card that's a part of that cycle that we can use to color fix in decks that are using multicolors, which is awesome, because if we draw this a little bit later on in a game of sealed or draft or what have you, this is actually a pretty relevant card that can come down once you do have the mana for it, gain you a little bit of life, and be a huge body that could potentially win you games. So having your forest cycler also be a body like this is just really, really good, at least for limited. Next up, we've got Dwarven Castle Guard. This is another one of the cards that we saw leaked a number of weeks ago as part of the starter set, but again, all of the commons and uncommons that are a part of that starter set will be able to be found in boosters, whereas the rares and mythics in the starter set are exclusive to that starter set. And if you're interested about, you know, what those cards are, I made a whole video just detailing the exclusive rares and mythics for the starter set. That's linked as part of the playlist in the comments and in the description, so check that out if you're curious. But Dwarven Castle Guard here is a 2/1 dwarf soldier for 1 white and 1, and when he dies, you make a 1/1 colorless hero creature token. Honestly, not that bad. It's going to fuel a lot of synergies, especially in limited. I don't know if it's quite going to make the cut in constructed. Replacing itself can be kind of good in aristocrat style decks, but I think we have a lot of 1-drops that can do that right now in standard, so I don't think a card like this is necessary. But in order to go into an archetype like that in limited, you need common cards like this that can be your meat and potatoes, and this card will be really good at being that. Next up, we've got Ambrosia Whiteheart. I almost said Wildheart. It wasn't that long ago that I played Final Fantasy 16. This is a 2/2 legendary bird with flash for 1 white and 1, and when he enters, you may return another permanent you control to its owner's hand, and then it also has a landfall ability. Whenever a land you control enters, he gets +1/+0 until end of turn. This is good for a lot of different reasons. Obviously, within limited, you're just going to use this to potentially return a land to your hand to just get another landfall trigger, not only for Ambrosia, but a lot of the chocobos and even some of the non-chocobo cards in this set tie into landfall, get value off of landfall triggers and that sort of thing. So being able to even just return a land here, because it doesn't have to be a non-land permanent that you bounce, so that you can, you know, replay the land and just re-trigger your landfall, can be really good. In fact, if you haven't made a land drop for the turn, you can play Ambrosia for 2, return a land, and then play your land to get the landfall trigger, and then it comes in untapped so that you can use it to make even more mana. So in certain situations, it's going to feel like Ambrosia is just a 1-cost 2/2 creature that returns that land to your hand and gets you those landfall triggers, which is going to be nice. But I can also see this making the cut in standard in like pixie decks. This is copies 9 through 12 of Nurturing Pixie, essentially. We just got Sun Pearl Kieran not too long ago, which does basically the same thing as this, except it has flying and it doesn't have the landfall trigger. So being able to have essentially 12 copies of Nurturing Pixie in Pixie decks is going to be an absolute nightmare and a headache for anyone who hates playing against Pixie decks right now. But those decks are going to get a lot better. And I also feel like in Standard, this card's going to be really good just in the Chocobo Landfall style decks. The bird fall decks, if you will, because we've seen so much support coming for Chocobo Tribal, for landfall decks, and that's absolutely going to be a relevant archetype within Standard, and I could see this card just being a really good piece of that puzzle. Just all around, I think this card is nuts. It's going to be really good in Limited. It's going to definitely make the cut in multiple different types of Standard decks. It's just a matter of if those Standard decks end up being tier 1 or not. Pixie, at the very least, I think will. And this might make the cut, even if you don't want to run all 12 copies. This could potentially make the cut over, you know, something like Sun Pearl Kieran. Pretty crazy. But next up, we've got Gaius von Balsar, a 3/2 legendary human soldier for 2 black and 2. And when he enters, you choose one. Each player sacrifices a creature token of their choice. Each player sacrifices a non-token creature of their choice, or each player sacrifices an enchantment of their choice. This is kind of awesome. This is basically Sheoldred's Edict on a body. For an extra 2 mana, you get a 3/2, and you get the ability to potentially flicker this to get the value off of it multiple turns in a row. It's almost a Ravenous Chupacabra, right? It's not as good because you don't get to target, but you do potentially get black enchantment removal, which is kind of huge. We barely ever see that. And granted, they do get to choose what enchantment they sacrifice, but still, getting to make them sacrifice an enchantment in a potentially mono black deck is kind of huge and not something that black typically has access to. I think where this card gets really interesting is if you can start to like make copies of Gaius or potentially flicker Gaius and re-trigger that enters ability. Start to get value off of this card in ways that aren't going to cost you the full 4 mana that you initially paid to get this thing out. You know, a flicker spell that costs 1 or 2 and re-triggers this, the more you can use stuff like that to trigger the Gaius, the more valuable a card like this being on the battlefield becomes. So I think there is the possibility for a card like this to see play in Standard in a deck like that can very cheaply and efficiently reuse his ETB ability. I think it could be really good. But even outside of that, if you're just playing him fairly, I think he's going to be really good in Limited. Being able to get 2-for-1 value, make them sacrifice something, and still have a body for just an uncommon that should be pretty easy to pick up in a draft. Actually seems really good to me. It's a little bit expensive, but I think it's going to be great. I really do. Next up, we've got Torgal, a Fine Hound. A Fine Hound indeed. A 2/2 legendary wolf for 1 green and 1. And whenever you cast your first human creature spell each turn, that creature enters with an additional +1/+1 on it for each dog and or wolf you control. So it gets a counter for each dog or wolf if it's the first human. So you want to build what? A dog/human tribal deck where you use both? If you slam a Torgal and then immediately slam a human right afterwards, it's going to get all of the counters immediately as long as you didn't play a creature before those 2 creatures. So you could line up some really interesting plays in a deck that has a bunch of dogs and has a bunch of humans, where you go wide with a bunch of dogs, and then like on turn 4 you play Torgal, and then you play a 2-drop human, and you immediately get a bunch of counters. You could even play Torgal on 3 and then a 1-drop human, and it could come into play with a bunch of extra counters. Or you could just play Torgal in a human tribal deck, and then just all of your humans, as long as you're just playing 1 a turn, will enter with an extra counter and get that extra value. That could be really good as well. And another really awesome part of this card is just the fact that it taps for a mana of any color. So your mana dork is actually super relevant in other ways. And granted, it's legendary, so that is kind of the one downside. If you're packing 4 of these in a deck, you can't go wide with them, right? You might be stuck with a card in your hand. And you can't use them to stack up additional copies of wolves or dogs. by having multiple Torgals in play to add to the ability. So there are some downsides because it's legendary, but it's still a really good card. In fact, just slamming this on 2 and having access to 4 mana on 4, where you can get those extra +1/+1 counters on whatever you play, should be pretty good, honestly. I just feel like this thing is so versatile. It can do a lot of different things and add a ton of value in the right deck. And I can't wait to brew with it because I think it's going to be very relevant in Standard. I really do. I think if any of the 2-drop mana dorks in Standard end up being relevant, it's this guy. This guy probably has the best chance, but in Limited, he's going to be crazy. Next up, we've got our first rare of the day, From Father to Son. A sorcery for 1 white and 1. You search your library for a vehicle card, reveal it, and put it into your hand, and it has flashback for 3 white and 4. So before we get to the other part of the ability, 2 mana to tutor up only a vehicle is like a really bad demonic tutor, right? You have to search for a very specific thing. Like, maybe that's useful in some deck, but I don't know if vehicles are good enough on their own to be worthy of tutoring up for an extra 2 mana. That being said, wanting to flash this back from the graveyard means you have to spend a whopping 7 mana, so even if you're just trying to get value off this card in that way, by maybe playing like a self-mill deck or a surveil deck, and then just playing this like without having to waste a card just from the graveyard because it incidentally ends up there, is also just really, really expensive. That being said, if you do play it from a graveyard, it ends up putting whatever you find straight onto the battlefield instead of into your hand. That's the other part of the card text that we didn't get to. And that does make it a considerable amount more powerful, but still, 7 mana is 7 mana, even if you self-mill this into the graveyard and you're casting it without using up a card, and you're getting, you know, all of that value by getting something straight onto the battlefield. 7's just a lot. So either way you cast this, I don't know if it's quite worth it. But I have to assume that Wizards made this as a rare for a reason. We already saw Balthier and Fran, which is a legendary Gruul creature that gives you extra combat steps in a vehicle deck. So maybe there is going to be some crazy vehicle deck in Naya that we can brew around this card and that card, and maybe there's more gas, no pun intended, coming for a deck like that, and it will end up being good enough. Maybe there's ways to reduce the cost of things that you're playing from the graveyard to make this card more efficient. It's hard to say until we see the rest of the set, but I have to assume that Wizards has a plan in mind for this card, and that there is some kind of ridiculous deck we can put together in Standard. That being said, in just the right deck in Limited, this could be good if there's enough vehicle support within the set. We did just get Aether Drift not too long ago, and there's a ton of vehicles in Standard now. So, like I said, it all comes back to me feeling like there has to be some kind of a deck that Wizards has in mind that this is going to be really, really good in. It is possible that maybe it's just meant to be in, you know, an older format deck, a modern deck or something, maybe in one of the Greasefang decks. But even then, I'm not sure if you can really take the time off to cast a spell like this, but let me know how you feel about this card in the comments below. Like I said, I gotta feel like there's potential for it and Wizards has something in mind. Next up, we've got Edgar, King of Figaro, a 4/5 legendary human artificer noble for 2 blue and 4, which is really expensive, but when Edgar enters, you draw a card for each artifact you control, and he also has the 2-headed coin ability. The first time you flip 1 or more coins each turn, those coins come up heads, and you win those flips. The flavor here is so amazing. Edgar from Final Fantasy VI being the gambler within that game, makes sense that you would draw cards off of artifacts and, you know, have something to do with coin flips. Just feels so right. But what's interesting about this card is we don't really have any coin flip mechanics in Standard. So this feels like, even though it's a Standard legal card, it's really meant for older formats where you can really take advantage of making every coin flip. Not every coin flip, but if you build around it properly, all of the coin flips that will matter the most, just make them come up heads the way that you want them to, could be absolutely backbreakingly powerful. And it makes me wonder, I think we've seen enough cards from this set so far to be pretty confident that there aren't any more coin flip cards coming in this set. But it does make me wonder if maybe in a future set coming down the line over the course of the next year, they do have ideas to bring back coin flip cards in a big way. And so this could be one of those like sleeper rares that they insert into a standard legal set that looks unplayable when it first comes out, and then like a year down the line a set releases with a bunch of cards that play into the theme, and all of a sudden it's really, really good. I think there is a chance that a card like this card in particular, could be along those lines and could end up being relevant in standard later on, because I don't think that they would put this in the standard legal set, part of the Final Fantasy set, if it wasn't going to be relevant in standard at some point. They could have easily just made this one of the commander cards. So that's my guess. My guess is we've seen enough cards from this set that, you know, that's not going to be a mechanic that's widespread within this set, the coin flip thing. But there probably is a set coming down the line where it will be, and eventually this guy will have his time to shine in standard. That being said, just drawing a bunch of cards off of artifacts when he enters seems kind of good anyway. Might be too expensive for standard, but hard to say. If you're in a go wide deck that just goes wide with enough artifacts, it could be nuts, and you could use it with flicker effects to draw even more cards. So I don't know, we'll have to wait and see. But next up, we've got Summon Titan, a 7/7 reach trample enchantment creature saga giant for 2 green and 3. How crazy is Magic pushed these days? We get a 7/7 reach trampler for 5 mana. The power creeps nuts, and we get these extra abilities for 3 turns because it's a saga as well. So on chapter 1, you mill 5 cards. On chapter 2, you return all land cards from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. And on chapter 3, until end of turn, another target creature you control gains trample and gets +X/+X, where X is the number of lands you control. One thing to keep in mind when evaluating cards like this is when chapter 3 triggers, you're going to have to sacrifice Titan, right? It goes away, so it's not going to get its own buff and be able to attack that combat. In fact, each of these summons that only has 3 chapters really only gets 1 turn to attack with unless you set up some way to give haste. Because on chapter 1, you just got done playing the thing, it can't attack yet, but you can hold it up as a blocker, which is really, really nice. And then on chapter 2, you get to swing in with it finally. And then if it survives and triggers its chapter 3, you still have to sacrifice it on chapter 3. So I don't think these cards are going to be quite as busted as they look on the surface because of how those play lines line up. But I still think it's super, super powerful. Having a blocker and a spell-like ability on chapter 1, and then another spell-like ability and a big attacker on chapter 2, and then still a third ability to close it out, is still a ton of value for one card that's only 5 mana. And again, because it's a creature, you can do stuff that can normally only target creatures and not enchantments, like flicker this guy to reset his lore counters, or bring him back from the graveyard with a reanimator spell. So I do think this guy is really, really, really good. But I also think people might over-evaluate the summons just a little bit, not realizing that most of them only get that 1-turn attack window. But again, the fact that you could block with 2 turns and get all of the value off the triggers is still really relevant. All the summons are really, really good. But next up, we've got a cycle, actually. We've already seen the Darkness Crystal. That one was spoiled, I think, on the very first day of spoiler season. But now we know that that is part of a cycle in each color of crystals. And we got all of them spoiled today. So this is the first one, the Wind Crystal, a legendary artifact for 2 white and 2. White spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. So every single one of these crystals reduces the cost of spells of the appropriate color by 1. That's just like a part of the cycle. They also have an activated ability that costs mana and tapping the crystal to do. And then they also have a static ability. The static ability on this is if you would gain life, you gain twice that much life instead, which could be really, really good for life gain decks. And then you also have this 6 mana activated ability, tap the Wind Crystal. Creatures you control gain flying and lifelink until end of turn. That's actually really, really good. In a life gain deck, being able to double the life that you're getting, and then also have this late game activated ability kind of for free, where all of your guys can swing in and gain a bunch of life and get you a bunch of life gain triggers, seems like icing on the cake. My only concern is that 4 mana is a lot. By the time you get this out, do you really need the cost reduction? And we're really just going to have to experiment with brewing to find out the answer to that question. But I still think there's a lot of potential for a card like this to be kind of nuts. Let me know how you feel about it in the comments. But we're going to move on to the next crystal in the cycle, and that's the Water Crystal, a legendary artifact for 2 blue and 2. All blue spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. The static ability on this one is if an opponent would mill 1 or more cards, they mill that many cards plus 4 instead, which honestly on its own is already like making me cringe. I absolutely hate it. But then it has an activated ability. Pay 2 blue and 4, tap it, and each opponent mills cards equal to the number of cards in your hand. But you gotta remember, you still have that static ability, so it's actually the number of cards in your hand plus 4. So even if you only have 1 card in your hand, you make them mill at least 5 cards, right? You make them mill 4, I guess, if you had no cards in hand, I don't think you'd mill any. Because technically you wouldn't mill even a single 1, so it wouldn't count as milling 1 or more cards, and therefore you wouldn't add another 4 to it with the static ability. So you do have to have at least 1 card in hand. But if you have a full grip of cards, you can just make them mill 11 by paying 6. And I think most of the time that part of the card is going to be kind of win more, and not really used unless you get later on in the game, you know, in a control deck or something like that. But just the fact that the static ability is that good and reduces the cost of your blue spells, it really makes me think that mill decks are coming back in a huge way. I would be very, very, very surprised if there isn't some kind of a mill deck that's super relevant in the standard meta after this set drops, because we've seen a couple other cards offering mill support, and now this thing just pushes it way over the edge. Not to mention the fact that it's probably the best color to try to get that cost reduction on, helps you hold up counter spells, and just all sorts of shenanigans. Card draw spells are going to cost you 1 less. This card just seems powerful, and it seems like mill is back in standard in a big way, and that makes me cringe. I absolutely hate it. I hate mill decks. If any of you guys remember when the rogue mill deck was big in standard, that one just made me facepalm every single day of my life. And it looks like we're maybe headed in that direction with a card like this, and that's scary. But let's move on. Next up, we've got the Fire Crystal, 2 red and 2 for a legendary artifact. Red spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. Creatures you control just straight up have haste, which is kind of awesome. You can also pay 2 red and 4, tap it, create a token that's a copy of target creature you control, and sacrifice it at the beginning of the next end step. This is the one that I'm most excited about. And there is a part of me that thinks it just costs too much for red decks to really care about. But there's another part of me that's just like, oh man, what kind of crazy, ridiculous control brew can we put together with creatures that have ETB triggers or attack triggers that we then get to cast for 1 less? We can dump 6 mana into this to make an extra token copy of one of those creatures to re-trigger the ETB, or if it has an ability that triggers on combat, on attack, or on dealing combat damage to an opponent or whatever, we make that token will have haste. The original and the token can swing in and trigger off dealing combat damage or off attacking. There's just so much potential to do some really ridiculous stuff here, but I am glad that the activated ability is a whopping 6 mana for this, because it feels a little bit like Fable of the Mirror Breaker otherwise. Just getting the cost reduction and the haste and this activated ability that can add a ton of value would be kind of busted if it wasn't, you know, costed. If it wasn't costed, is that even a word? Costed. If it didn't cost this much to activate, that slows it down considerably, which is how you kind of balance it out. But the fact that you get 3 different ways in which you get value off this card just seems really interesting, and the fact that you can just brew around this in interesting ways and try to take advantage of all 3 abilities. Some decks are going to want to use the haste more. Some decks are going to want to use the make a token more. You can use this in an Izzet deck with like the Enigma Jewel to give you 2 colorless mana to use the ability, so it only feels like you're spending 4 mana instead of 6. Then maybe you want to be in like an artifact creature deck to abuse the fact that you've already got a bunch of artifacts you're trying to play. Maybe you want to play Simulacrum Synthesizer. I don't know. I'm going down a rabbit hole now and going off the rails, but the tap ability is super powerful, the static ability is very relevant, and the cost reduction is awesome. Maybe we use this in some kind of a new big red deck, where we have creatures that are expensive, but we're using them for their utility, for control things that we can use with them. I don't know. I feel like this with the Carnosaur would be really, really good. So is there a way to build a deck that makes that work? Let me know in the comments. I'm going to have to brainstorm a lot more, but there is just a ton of potential here to tap into, and this one looks really exciting. But next up, we have the last in the cycle, the Earth Crisis. What a band. The Earth Crystal, a legendary artifact for 2 green and 2. Green spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. If 1 or more +1/+1 counters would be put on a creature you control, twice that many +1/+1 counters are put on that creature instead, and you can pay 6, tap it, distribute 2 +1/+1 counters among 1 or 2 target creatures you control. Seems okay. We already have a version of the Ozolith that is kinda like this, except it's only 2 mana. The big difference is you don't get the cost reduction to green spells on that, and the tap ability doesn't cost nearly as much. I still feel like the Ozolith is a little bit better, it's just more efficient than this, but still, getting a cost reduction on all of your green spells is not nothing, and could end up being super relevant. So there is a world where I could see this being relevant in. I'm just not really sure what that deck looks like. Obviously, a rare like this is going to be nuts and limited, but in Constructed, it feels... I think this is probably the worst one we've seen. It feels a little win more, it feels a little expensive. By the time you can use the activated ability, you should probably already be winning the game in a green deck anyway. And by the time you play this, you probably don't need the cost reduction as much either. If you're playing a green deck, you're probably running like Llanowar Elf or whatever. Even the dog seems to be upset. I'm sorry, buddy, I'll move on. He's like, you're dragging this on with the crystals, man. We don't need to talk about the crystals anymore. But let me know in the comments if you have an idea for how to use this in a deck, because I am open to it. I think there is potential for a card like this, but I do think it's the worst of the cycle that we've seen so far. Next up, we've got Joshua Phoenix's Dominant. I am super excited about this card. A 3/4 legendary human noble wizard for 3 mana in the colors of Boros. And when he enters, you discard up to 2 cards and then draw that many cards. And then he also has an ability to pay 5 mana in the colors of Boros, tap him, exile him, return him to the battlefield transformed under its owner's control, only activate as a sorcery. So a 3/4 for 3 that, you know, draws you 2 cards, discard 2 cards, draw 2 cards, similar to Tersa, is gonna be really good. I think this is even more gas for like the Jeskai Oculus style decks, where it's just another card that can dig you 2 cards deeper, put 2 more cards in your graveyard to set yourself up for that deck, which just seems awesome. This has a decent butt as well, but you also have a backup way of getting some of those creatures out of the graveyard when you transform this, because when you do flip it, it turns into Phoenix Warden of Fire, which is a 4/4 flying lifelinker that on Chapter 1 and 2 deals 2 damage to each opponent. Now, that's a little bit misleading. Because of the lifelink, you're actually dealing 2 damage and gaining all of that life. That immediately makes this card a lot better in Commander or any other kind of multiplayer format, because if you're playing at a table with 3 other players, they each take 2, and you gain 6 when this flips. And that's way better than what it's going to do when you're one-on-one. But even in Standard, getting a 4/4 flying lifelinker and then hitting them for 2 and gaining 2 is pretty good for 5 mana without having to use up a card, because you already had Joshua on the battlefield, and he probably already did what you want him to do by drawing and discarding. So this is kind of just extra, and it feels really good. On the next turn, it will do it again, and you can swing in, do 4 more damage in the air, gain 4 more life, and then on Chapter 3, you get Flames of Rebirth. Return any number of target creature cards with total mana value 6 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. Then you exile Phoenix and return it to the battlefield front side up as Joshua, which is honestly kinda crazy, Because if you're playing this in a Jeskai Oculus deck, that means you could take 2 Oculuses from your yard and put them back on the battlefield. Or you could take an Oculus and a Tersa, or an Oculus and a Kiora. The fact that it hits a total mana value of 6 is the perfect number to make this kind of nuts in Jeskai Oculus. So, granted, it takes you a little bit longer to get there. It's not as fast as an Oculus deck wants to be, but I think it adds a lot of long-term value and lasting power to Oculus, where if Oculus deck gets in a situation where the opponent is dealing with the board state and you're not winning as quick as you want, this is just sort of a free way built into a card that you kind of already want to play anyway, to just discard 2, draw 2, just to set the deck up, to just also have a way to trigger this. You know, if you don't have your recommission in your hand or your helping hand or whatever, Joshua's just sitting there waiting to be used, and you flip them and then you eventually do the thing, or maybe you just flip them and you win in the air. Like, I just feel like this could be a lot of value for those decks, and even outside of those decks, this card could be kind of nuts. It's just doing a lot. And don't forget that when it does leave and come back as Joshua after chapter 3, it's going to trigger that Enters ability again. You're going to get to discard 2 cards and draw that many cards again and set yourself up for even more value. So I feel like he ends up being sort of a must-answer threat, because he gives you this long-term inevitability of getting everything that you want out of the graveyard, like you're trying to do anyway in that deck. But if they do answer this, use removal on it, then they might not be using removal on, you know, a Tersa or a Kiora or an Oculus that's in play. So you create this kind of like screwed if you do, screwed if you don't situation for your opponent, and I kind of love that. So I'm absolutely going to test this in a Jeskai Oculus deck. I think that could be nuts. I'm hoping there are other decks that can make use of this card as well, because I think it's just awesome. But the flavor, for anyone that's played Final Fantasy 16, the flavor is so perfect, and I love it. Thank you. Next up is the last card of the day, Jenova, Ancient Calamity. This card is bonkers. 1/5 legendary alien. We have our first official alien, setting us up for the next set that's coming after Final Fantasy, Edge of Eternities, which is going to be a sci-fi, space opera, Star Wars style set, and absolutely have aliens. So they're definitely using this card and probably other cards like this to casually insert aliens into Magic like a Trojan horse before that set drops, so they can be like, what, aliens were always here? For sure. This is a 1/5 legendary alien for 4 mana in the colors of Golgari. At the beginning of combat on your turn, put a number of +1/+1 counters equal to this creature's power on up to 1 other target creature. That creature becomes a mutant in addition to its other types, and whenever a mutant you control dies during your turn, you draw cards equal to its power. This card is nuts, man. This card is nuts in a bunch of different ways. First of all, it triggers as soon as you play it. You don't have to wait for upkeep. It doesn't have to survive a turn cycle. You play it, you go to combat, you put at least 1 counter on something, and then if that thing dies, you're drawing a bunch of cards. And you gotta remember too, you're not drawing cards equal to the number of counters on it. You're drawing cards equal to its power. So if you already had like a 3-drop that was like a 4/3 out, and then on turn 4 you play Jenova, you put a counter on it, you swing now as a 5/4, and they trade with it, you're drawing 5 cards. You're drawing 5 cards if they trade with it. That's crazy. And then we've already seen that aristocrats are coming back in a huge way, sacrifice decks are coming back in a huge way. So if they don't trade with it, and they're like, oh, I don't want you to draw 5 cards, so they let it through, when otherwise they could have blocked and trade with it, well, now you're getting through for free damage, 5 damage, and then in your post-combat main phase, you can still sacrifice it for value and draw a bunch of cards. And that seems kind of crazy to me. Yeah, it just seems like the amount of value you can get out of Jenova is nuts. You can run it in a deck that's built around +1/+1 counters, so that you have ways to put even more counters on Jenova, which puts even more counters on other creatures, and maybe you're not even trying to take advantage of sacrifice outlets to draw cards. Maybe you're just doubling down on that power buff, and that could be kind of nuts as well. Reminds me a little bit of Helena and Elena, but you could also run it in just a sacrifice style deck that doesn't have big bodies, but you're getting extra value when you sacrifice your cards. because you get to draw cards equal to the power, and even if that's only, you know, 2 cards, 3 cards, that's still extra card draw every single turn for kind of free in a deck that already wants to sacrifice its creatures anyway. And we know that deck's going to be super powerful because of the new Sephiroth card. It's like the most powerful sacrifice aristocrat style payoff we've seen in Magic in a long time. So I definitely think there's going to be a deck that uses Sephiroth and Jenova and a sacrifice aristocrat style. And that's going to be nuts. But again, I don't think this card is limited to that. I think you could play this in a +1/+1 counters matters deck, or just in a mid-range deck that's trying to be aggressive, Golgari mid-range, where it's just increasing the value of your creatures. And they kind of have to kill this before they kill the creatures they want to kill, or else you're going to draw a bunch of cards. I just feel like this card's super useful in a lot of different ways and going to be completely nuts. Let me know if you think I'm crazy in the comments, or if you have an idea about how to brew around this card that I didn't bring up. But I think this card is just nuts. It's also worth pointing out that if you play Changelings with this, shapeshifters that have every creature type, they're already gonna be mutants, and you could just get a ton of extra value off sacrificing those in addition to whatever you put the counter on. There's just so much you can do with this card, and I think it's nuts. But that's going to do it for today. Thanks so much for checking out the video. Please like the video, helps me get it out to more people. Subscribe if you're new so you don't miss any of my content. We'll have more spoiler videos on the way as these cards continue to drop. This set is looking absolutely bananas right now. I'll see you tomorrow. Thanks so much for checking out my channel. I'd like to give a huge shout out to all of my patrons over at Patreon. Without you guys, this channel would not be possible, so honestly, thank you from the bottom of my heart for all of your contributions. If you haven't yet, like and subscribe. The more likes we get and the quicker we get them, the bigger this channel will grow and the faster it will grow. I'd love nothing more than this channel to become something very special for you guys, but it's entirely up to you how fast that happens. Also, if you'd like more deck text, that's somewhere over there, and if you'd like to see what else the channel's been up to lately, that's somewhere up that way. Also, subscribe, circle below, do all the things.